Oh, wait, you know what? Oh, okay. Hey, hello, everybody. Hi, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience. And I don't have anything prepared for today. I just got back from the doctor's office, so I just wanted to, of course, I always forget. Just wanted to go straight into the live chat because I had a lot of fun last week, and I'd sort of forgotten how much fun this is, at least for me, hopefully for you too. But yeah, I did have things that I was like working on preparing. Like there's this one study that came out that basically argues that color perception elicits similar emotions cross-culturally, which is sort of a provocative claim. Hey dude, where you been? I have been right here in Philadelphia. Yeah, I know, I've been sort of absent. The main reasons are I started a new job, which was demanding because it's like sort of outside of my technical wheelhouse. And I have a baby, right? That takes, you know, a pretty disproportionate share of one's time, particularly when your wife is trying to start a business and you're both working, and we do not have any childcare, you know, available because we're trying to keep everybody safe. Yeah, also I've had pink eye, which, you know, very irritating. Hey, what's up, Daryl? I promise I will get back to you. I literally just got home from the doctor's office, and so yeah, it's just been like, I barely have enough time to sleep, but I will get back to you. Do you have a dualist view of consciousness and the body? I do not. In fact, so while dualism, just so everybody understands, dualism is basically a perspective in neurophilosophy that has been around for a very long time. It actually arguably predates what is the more commonly held conception of consciousness, which is not dualist. But basically it stipulates that the mind, the human consciousness, exists independently of our sort of physical reality. Oh, geez, you know what? Or our biology alone. There are different sort of conceptions of dualism. There's like something called compatibilism, where basically the short story is that like it is still dualist, but it's like they basically accept that biology is very, very important to consciousness. It's just not the entirety of what generates consciousness. So I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of neuroscientists these days are no longer dualists. There are some holdouts. Mostly they tend to aggregate in neurophilosophy and not so much in like hardcore biology, hardcore neuroscience, which is my school, where I come from. But yeah, I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of neuroscientists are no longer dualists. And I'm happy to go into why I am confident in not being dualist. If you'd like, I'm more than happy to. That's right, I sent you a tweet of why I believe consciousness is purely biological. Oh, well, how relevant. Yeah, so it looks like Daryl, you used to have, I've been friends with Daryl, just so everybody knows now, for quite a while. You did used to have a sort of, I don't know, maybe a soft spot for dualism, or at least you seem to be open to it. And a lot of friction for at least some people with regards to dualism arises because, you know, it can sort of come up against religious perspectives and spiritual perspectives. And particularly once you start to get into arguments regarding free will, like, for example, does it exist? That can become kind of challenging for somebody who is devoutly religious. So yeah, but I'm happy to go into just some of the sort of the bullet line, top line points of why dualism probably isn't the optimal framework to understand consciousness, at least today. What's the deal with British Columbia? It's neither British nor Colombian. I know, right? What's the deal with donut holes? They're neither donuts nor holes. Do you think that holding a non-dualist view of the mind and body necessarily results in a hard determinist conviction? All right. I mean, it sounds like Jav has at least studied some philosophy. So determinist, hard determinism, basically argues that the universe, like, and this extends beyond neuroscience and consciousness, but that basically the universe is let's say, explicable by the physical events that we can, measure at least. Not necessarily only see, but, we can use computer systems, technology to characterize, all of which obey the laws of physics. And just because we can't characterize the physics of all these systems doesn't mean that there isn't some law of physics that could and would. So do I think so? I bet that if you were to sit down 10 neuroscientists, PhDs in the discipline, and they all did what I kind of did, which was study a specific component of the relationship between biological activity and behavior or consciousness, they probably don't think of it, don't extrapolate that far, right? That you don't necessarily have to believe that in hard determinism you don't necessarily have to have like a conviction when it comes to hard determinism. Now, for me, I think it does. So, I think that there are a lot of necessary or at least logical conclusions to which one can come if you accept that dualism is inaccurate. So, for example, if you think that behavior, consciousness, everything that you consider to be you emerges from biological activity, most of which occurs in the brain, or at least the nervous system, then it's very difficult to argue that free will exists, for example. Well, then if you, and I think a lot of neuroscientists, I've seen a minority of neuroscientists argue that free will still exists. There are some, for sure. There's more of them, in my experience, than those who embrace dualism. And they make convincing arguments. I think, I have seen some convincing arguments that there is room for free will. But for me, everything I've studied, my specific experimental experiences, observations, suggest to me that, yes, that hard determinism is sort of a likely conclusion of a perspective that is non-dualist. I did before, but my consciousness was effectively shut off intravenously by a chemical. Hey, that is a great example. So pharmacology is a great tool to sort of probe consciousness. Altered states of consciousness are a great tool. In fact, like the earliest stages of neuroscience really were born out of observing what happens when somebody isn't necessarily pharmacologically altered, but like physically. Like somebody, there was a king, I believe, who was jousting back when people like seriously jousted and it was like an important thing that people cared about. Not that it's not important to any fans of jousting, but it's not one of the most popular sports these days. And he had some wooden stakes essentially go through his skull into his occipital lobe. Occipital lobe's right back here. That's where your visual cortex is. It's a giant part of the brain. It's almost entirely devoted to vision, to deciphering vision, different components of vision. And two very famous, what would probably be called at the time natural philosophers, maybe anatomists. There wasn't really like a rigorously defined discipline of science at the time, but they were, at least the predecessors to neuroscience. Andreas Vesalius, whose work you've probably seen, at least on the internet. Those beautiful hand-drawn anatomical diagrams, and they're usually in these very sort of like Renaissance adjacent kind of poses of like a man who's like standing like this, and you can see all the musculature and like the vasculature, and he does, that kind of work, like those kinds of kind of creepy but also pretty interesting pictures. Those were probably done by Andreas Vesalius. His work was essentially the first update to anatomy, human anatomy, since like, I don't know, maybe over 1,000 years. Because before him, essentially the only resource was by a dude, an ancient Greek guy named Galen. Really impressive what Galen had accomplished, but we'd come a long way, or at least we had better tools. And so Vesalius, and because anatomy was anathema, anatomy was a sacrilege to do that kind of work. Everybody had to do it sort of hush-hush, and that's what he did. Anyway, so it was him, interesting guy, and then Ambroise Paré, a French guy. And they essentially like evaluated what happened when this guy's head was so thoroughly damaged and brain was so thoroughly damaged, and they observed that it was specific things about his capabilities, specifically his vision, this king with the wooden stakes in his brain, that were disrupted. And so, hey, there must be some relationship. Like, why is it that he can still do other things, but it's only vision, or mostly only vision, plus probably a lot of pain, that are disrupted from such a significant injury. So that's just one example of like the early stages of neuroscience. And then as we went, pharmacology became one of the best tools that we had to evaluate, okay, like we see that, when we give somebody opium, right, milk of the poppy, or laudanum, right, these extracts of the opium poppy, certain things happen, right? Analgesia, or pain killing, euphoria, just feeling good, getting high. And so therefore, just because we were using that tool and evaluating what happened when you take a system and you just perturb it, is what we call it. You just sort of, jar it this way or that with a drug or an injury. That's why we have named a lot of receptors after drugs. So for example, for opium, we have the mu-opioid receptors. So those are the receptors that heroin, oxycodone, fentanyl, opium, or the multiple alkaloids in opium all bind. They're called, and so they're named after, opioids, and the opium poppy. Similarly, a certain subset of acetylcholine receptors. Acetylcholine is actually one of the first neurotransmitters that was ever discovered. Acetylcholine is involved in a lot of things, and evolutionarily very ancient neurotransmitter. It was found that nicotine binds to certain acetylcholine receptors, and therefore they are called nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And so all of this to say, like, I think it is laudable that you would, interpret an experience of being put into either, anesthesia or general anesthesia. Particularly, you notice that just this one molecule or a couple of molecules is enough to completely alter everything about your experience. That is one of the lines of evidence, only one, but an important one, I would argue, that consciousness, that we are not dual, that consciousness is not a dual system. It emerges from the brain, and there we go. Props, kudos. What do you have to say about CDC admitting their COVID death count was off by 94%? So that's actually not quite what that report said. Rather, and I am totally unsurprised that that publication has been interpreted in so many different ways. But unfortunately, certain aspects of our medical system and certain aspects of how fatalities, how pathologies are recorded aren't really widely appreciated. So basically what they were saying is that about, give or take, about 5% of the COVID fatalities were recorded by some physician, some overworked, some exhausted physician as this is just COVID. There was nothing else going on. There wasn't diabetes, there wasn't, hypertension, there wasn't a cardiovascular disease, and on. There wasn't a stroke. And so therefore it wasn't something plus COVID. They were just like, boom, we have to move. And keep in mind, a lot of these deaths were recorded at a time in the country where a lot of hospitals in some of the cities that were hit first were really overworked. They were totally understaffed, and so it's not like they were sitting there really digging into the biology of this now deceased person. So there's that. Another thing is that, like, just because there was something else that was wrong, some other medical malady, and then also COVID, doesn't mean that COVID had nothing to do with it. So, one way to think about it is that, like, okay, let's say, you have diabetes, right? So, really severe diabetes, you have to inject insulin, right? And so that is a malady. That's a serious malady. It is the source of a lot of suffering and fatalities. So let's say you have that, right? And then you get hit by a bus. Did the diabetes kill you, or was it the bus? Right? It's not quite that simple, obviously, because the biology of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, probably has some really interesting biology that we definitely still don't understand. It's remarkable how much we already do understand about this virus, right? This just, came out of nowhere and spread so fast at an unprecedented rate internationally. And so, I'm impressed by how much we already do know about it, but I am confident that we're going to learn a lot about both SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, also about virology, about how viruses interact with the human body, and then also about the human body, as always. So, there might be some really interesting, tragic, unfortunate interactions between, this virus altering, your cardiovascular system in such a way where if you also have hypertension or if you also have some kind of heart disease, that puts you in a totally separate risk category. But you'd still be around if you weren't infected with COVID-19. So, and then a final thing is that, like, in the United States, as well as many other countries, a huge proportion of our population has something else, right? They're suffering from some medical condition, right? It's why, the medical industry is so profitable, right? And so to suggest that, like, okay, so, only this small group of people, which is probably much smaller than we think, due to the, how medical records are taken and all that kind of stuff, to suggest that means that COVID-19 is a trivial issue, that's a misunderstanding. Like that is the incorrect conclusion to which one should arrive. And also, it's just pure statistics, right? This has no actual science in it. I mean, it has some science, right? Obviously, they're describing a biological event, and a medical event, but it's really just numbers. So, I wouldn't throw away my mask and go to a dance party anytime soon just because of that number. Now, I think that the same person said the point is that the CDC can make mistakes. Absolutely. And in fact, I hope that there is a, not to be too macabre, right? I hope there's a postmortem on all of the mistakes that have been made from soup to nuts, from the beginning, from a regulatory perspective, from an administrative perspective, and then also from, the CDC. For anybody that's not in the United States, that's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the FDA and the NIH, right? Like, there have definitely been mistakes that were made, most notably early on when the Surgeon General came out and basically said, do not go get masks, don't wear them, they're ineffective, for reasons that are still pretty unclear. That is a major mistake. And I remember I was a policy advisor to a candidate for the Pennsylvania State House here in Philly. And I was on that team mostly just because of the opioid addiction epidemic, because, it is a very severe concern here in Philly. But then COVID-19 hit, and I was the closest PhD to this person, right? And I remember, we did like a town hall just for people in the prospective district. And of course, that question came up, like, hey, should we be getting masks? And, it was still in that time when, a bunch of, federal parts of the executive branch of the United States were basically saying, don't go get masks. And there were articles in the popular press, don't go get them. And I remember talking to my parents and then doing this town hall, basically saying, like, far be it from me to, contradict far more senior biomedical, officials, but I can tell you that I got a mask. I am wearing masks. And I think that the science is pretty conclusive that not only the science, but like the epidemiology from past respiratory conditions, pretty clear that they're helpful. And so, I didn't want to say like, oh, they're wrong because, I'm just one PhD. But I still said like, I'm going to do it. So yeah, I mean, like, final thing, and then I'll get off this soapbox. It's important to understand that in science, and that includes, evidence-based medicine, mistakes are part of the process. It's frustrating, I understand, and it's hard to understand for somebody who's not in the discipline, because you're used to going to a doctor, and the doctor, he or she tells you what's wrong, tells you what to do, and then you do or don't recover, right? The answers are the answers. Very deterministic experience. Or maybe you interact with like lawyers where all the laws are known. I mean, they're made by humans, and you can just go to the book, go to the writing, and then they can be interpreted in different ways by judges, but like, we know the bounds of this legal system. In science, we don't. In science, we're still trying to figure out these questions. We don't even know what questions to ask oftentimes. And so, that is one of the biggest problems I've observed ongoing. It's still happening, where the popular press will see oftentimes a preprint article, meaning an article that is posted on a repository online, hasn't been peer reviewed, and then say this study shows that, COVID-19, whatever, is only deadly to people who are, who don't have blood, their blood antigen group A, right? Don't have type A blood. And you'll see like 5 articles made, posted, and this publication has not been peer reviewed. And so, you just see particularly like in March and then, in April, you saw these waves of just like what equate to misinformation. Totally benign. I mean, I don't think anybody was trying to mislead, but it was just a byproduct of the fact that people are just not used to the reality that part of doing science is making mistakes and correcting those mistakes, learning from them, and then progressing forward. And those mistakes are very frequently caught in the peer review process by other experts. And that's how science works. We're only human, and we're limited by our knowledge, our current technology that enables us to ask certain questions. And so, yeah, they make mistakes. The stakes are high for them because they're dealing with life-threatening biomedical issues. But yeah, I mean, I understand it's frustrating. Believe me, it's frustrating as somebody who has a family. So I empathize with your frustration. But that does not mean that just because they made one mistake, that means that everything that they're saying is wrong. Right? That is a logical fallacy. Nice chair. Yeah, I actually just got this chair. This is the first technically nice chair I've ever had. Whew, so much nicer. The other chair that I used to have was like a pretend version of one of these, and it was literally like $30. And the difference is, what's also very cool about this chair? It has very little to do with the chair. It's that the wheels are rollerblade wheels. Brilliant. It feels like you're floating when you move. It's so much better. Okay, I've been wanting to get off benzos. Can CBD be helpful with my anxiety? Brandy Shaley. So if it depends on so benzodiazepines, for anybody that's not familiar, that is a family of drugs that includes drugs like Valium or diazepam, Klonopin or clonazepam, and so a bunch of other ones, right? Lorazepam, and they are oftentimes, they used to be used quite a bit more frequently to treat things like anxiety or insomnia. These days, not so much. They can be used to treat panic attacks, anxiety attacks. They can also be used to stop a seizure that's progressing. And then they're also used recreationally by some people, typically people who are predisposed to anxiety, because they don't really have typical euphoric effects. They don't have a significant dopaminergic component to their effects, so they're not like cocaine, certainly not like cocaine, but they're not even like opioids. And so, but the issue is, the reason I'm going into this is withdrawal from benzodiazepines can be life-threatening. The reason being that the mechanism by which benzodiazepines work is by making GABA receptors a little bit more sensitive to GABA. So in other words, it's sort of like cranking up the inhibitory tone in your brain, making it less likely for neurons to fire action potentials by altering a neurotransmitter receptor that is typically stimulated by a neurotransmitter in your brain. The problem is that after you've taken them for a long time, your brain starts to turn down the volume on its own, right? Its own volume knob, because this other volume knob is cranked up, this benzodiazepine volume knob. So as a result, once you stop taking them, that activity, that reduced activity of your own brain's GABAergic mechanisms is still low, right? It takes time for your brain to readapt. That's why there's withdrawal symptoms. And so unlike opioids, for example, arguably an even more addictive drug, opioid withdrawal is probably the most severe set of symptoms one can experience, but it actually will not, it's not life-threatening. Benzodiazepine withdrawal, also, by the way, like alcohol withdrawal, can be life-threatening because of that suppressed inhibitory activity during withdrawal, and that can cause seizures and potentially fatalities. So all of this to say, if you're trying to get off benzodiazepines, the best thing you can do, even if you're taking them illicitly, you're taking them recreationally, you're getting them, from drug dealers, whatever, definitely reach out to a physician. You won't get in trouble or anything like that. That's not what they're there for. But what they can do is make sure that you have a plan to usually wean yourself off. But then also they can prescribe other medications that are not habit forming, they're not addictive, but they can help to mitigate just some of the withdrawal symptoms, which can be really severe in benzodiazepines, but also ensure that you don't have seizures. Now, will CBD help? So CBD, for anybody who's not familiar, is cannabidiol. It's one of the most prominent cannabinoids in cannabis. Another example, by the way, of neuroscientists learning about our brain, our nervous system, through the activities of drugs, namely cannabis. We discovered that humans have cannabinoid receptors. And we basically have two cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2. CB1 is a receptor to which THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, principally binds. And it is what we think is responsible for the majority of the sort of psychoactive, pseudo-psychedelic activity of cannabis. CBD, on the other hand, cannabidiol, tends to bind CB2 receptors a little bit more. CB2 receptors are much more densely expressed in the periphery, outside of the brain. So there's a couple issues here. So first, CBD isn't as widely studied as THC. THC itself isn't as widely studied as it should be at a level that's commensurate with how widely it's consumed, because it remains as illegal as a drug can be in the United States. So just to give you an example, it took my lab. I worked in the lab of a very, very senior scientist, on the board of directors for certain components of the NIH and stuff. It took her over a year to get the okay from the DEA to work with cannabis. It took well over a year, I should say. So, if I was trying to start my own lab and I really wanted to understand this question, does CBD, could it be an addiction treatment? Could it be a withdrawal treatment? I just wouldn't be able to do it because I need to be productive within my first year or so at least, and I wouldn't even be able to touch it for at least that amount of time, probably longer, because I am nowhere near as senior a scientist as she is. All of this to say we don't understand enough of the biology of CBD. Oh, another issue is that the cannabinoid receptor system in the human body is extremely, extremely complicated. And they are some of the most widely, numerously expressed receptors in the human body and brain. So they have their fingers in a lot of different things. That's why when somebody smokes pot, they get this wide range of effects, everything from, the munchies to getting giggly to, getting sleepy to getting energetic to getting euphoric, all of these various things, because it is a byproduct of how widely expressed and complicated the endogenous cannabinoid receptor system is. So can CBD be helpful? Potentially. There are some studies that suggest that CBD for some people help to mitigate some anxiety, help to mitigate things like leg discomfort that some people experience when they're trying to go to sleep. A variety of maladies can help to reduce pain in some patients. There's also some evidence that they can increase pain, or it can increase pain in some patients. So it's just this really complicated story. We need to study it more. But what I would recommend is definitely don't rely on CBD as your primary, mode of assistance if you're trying to get off benzodiazepines, because almost certainly, depending on your dosage, how much you take, how regularly, then it could very well not be remotely enough, and you could be in a very dangerous situation. Okay, looks like we have a caller. Oops. Is it gonna? Okay. So I think your name is Jacob. Where are you calling from? Can you hear me?
Hi, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm good. Have we spoken before?
We haven't, no.
Oh, we haven't.
Not, but yeah, I've seen some of your stuff, and I think the last scope that you done, I caught the end of it.
Cool. What's on your mind?
But yeah. So my question, I've got so many questions, but I think for today, I'll spare your time and just go for the quite an interesting one. So I'm quite interested in psychoactive stuff, sort of dimethyltryptamine. Haven't taken any yet. But sort of interested in psilocybin and things like that. And just wanted to know your view on how you see the pineal gland, in dimethyltryptamine, because, from the research I've done, it apparently is the same chemical that's released when you're born and when you die.
Right.
So from what I understand, dimethyltryptamine is supposed to be something that could possibly give some insight, or have some sort of positive attributes coming out of that, as opposed to just getting high type thing.
Yeah, right on.
So
Okay.
I'd like to know what your views were.
It's a great topic. So, so just so everybody is on the same page, dimethyltryptamine is a psychoactive psychedelic drug that's most notably found. It's found in a lot of different things, but it's most closely associated with a certain group of mushrooms, oftentimes called magic mushrooms, like most popularly in a kind of mushroom called Psilocybe cubensis. And so, the psychedelic that's at a higher concentration in those mushrooms is actually an analog of DMT, dimethyltryptamine. It's 4-phosphoryl dimethyltryptamine. It's basically a DMT molecule with a little phosphate group attached. They have slightly different pharmacologies. So let's go one by one here. So first, the pineal gland is this little, really rather small structure right at the top of the thalamus. And it's very evolutionarily ancient, and it gained a lot of notoriety because a guy named Rick Strassman wrote a book called The Spirit Molecule decades ago. Very interesting book, but it also had a ton of speculation in it. It wasn't. It was really a theory that he was positing, and so when it comes to like any evidence that dimethyltryptamine is found at meaningful concentrations within the brain just in general, let alone the pineal gland, there's not a lot of evidence that it's ever released at levels that are higher than what we call trace amounts, meaning that you can find just small levels of this molecule, but it's not even remotely close, like not even in the same area code or same town as like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, right? I see it very regularly, the claim that I think Joe Rogan makes this claim all the time, that dimethyltryptamine is it's produced in the brain, and that it's associated.
He likes to speak about the 5-MeO one, doesn't he?
That one's there's a bunch of analogs. That DMT is released when we're dreaming or when we're having near-death experiences. There's really no actual scientific evidence that is true, and in fact we have explanations for all of those things, for near-death experiences, for dreaming, that really we don't really need to turn to some psychedelic molecule to explain. We can explain dreams without any need for psychedelics. We can explain near-death experiences in the same ways. So there's that. Now, what can you learn from an experience using dimethyltryptamine? I would suggest yes, that it like I was saying before, neuroscientists have learned about the nervous system and consciousness through understanding the biology of altered states of consciousness. And so basically what DMT, pretty much all psychedelics have rather similar pharmacological effects in the brain. They have some slight nuances, which is responsible for their slightly different effects. But broadly speaking, they all interact with the same receptor system, serotonergic receptor system, and mostly a certain serotonin receptor called the 5-HT2A receptor. So this receptor and the serotonergic system regulates a huge variety of consciousness. I think the serotonin system has the greatest number of different kinds of receptors of any signaling system in the brain. I think there's 14 subtypes. So they do a bunch of different things. But so, just like you can learn from the experience of, standing, by the White Cliffs of Dover, I guess, to use an example that might be a little bit more proximal to you, or, like the Grand Canyon, or in front of a redwood forest, and have this sort of transformative, experience. You can learn from that unique experience. Same goes for an altered state, associated with a pharmacological agent. But there doesn't have to be a kind of, metaphysical or any kind of maybe narrative explanation for why it would be that this one molecule is more valuable or is more capable of doing that than any other, right? So essentially, the short story is that there's really no evidence that it's produced at meaningful levels in the brain or plays any role in regulating consciousness, but I do think we can learn from those experiences.
Yeah. Do you think that, thank you for your insight, I really appreciate that. Do you think that the reason why there hasn't been any evidence is because there hasn't been the right funding into these studies, or has there been, sufficient studies that have been carried out? Because I do know that things like this tend to be a bit taboo, and funding for them, possibly, wouldn't be, as lucrative, or there wouldn't really be much use in really testing it. So is it because there's lack of testing, or is it simply because, there've been tests and, it's not met sort of, correct standards?
I think that is a very, very fair point to make. You're absolutely right. For decades, really, like Tim Leary, if you don't know who he was, but it doesn't. We can get into that if you'd like. Tim Leary, John C. Lilly, these folks really damaged our ability to study psychedelics, because and really the hippie movement in general, because it, all of a sudden this family of drugs that has no like inherent social effect. It's just, they're just drugs. Became associated with a social movement and and a political ideology and so on. And so for decades, up until kind of recently, you're right, there wasn't a lot of studies of psychedelics. There were some, which is how we know their pharmacological activity. But it is totally fair, much like cannabis, CBD, for example. You're right. They are not studied at a level commensurate with what we can learn from them, as well as their potential psychiatric utility. Now, that said, over the past few years, there has been a sort of renaissance of psychedelics science. And so, for example, there are clinical trials. I think some specifically using psilocybin, but also MDMA, LSD, clinical trials to use them to treat various, specific psychiatric
PTSD and stuff like that. I know that.
That's right, PTSD, as well as depression associated with terminal cancer, these types of things. And then also there are labs cropping up doing, work that would be reminiscent of, you probably know Alexander Shulgin, and David Nichols, like really diving into the medicinal chemistry and seeing, okay, what happens if we take a DMT molecule and we add a bromine here, or we add, whatever, just some atom to the molecule, what happens to their effects, and then also what happens to their pharmacology. So that is happening more now than I've ever seen before, even in Philly. I mean, there are these studies going on, but it is fair. I mean, but the studies to evaluate whether or not DMT is released in the brain have been done. They've been done to a fairly satisfying extent. And so but that is a very fair point.
No, cool. Really appreciate. I won't take up any of more of your time, but greatly appreciate, and I'll give you a follow and check it out another time.
Right on. Thanks for calling in, man. Talk to you soon.
Cheers for your help, man. Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Oh, we have another caller. Oh, Jav. Yeah, we were just chatting. So it looks like we're connected. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Hi, my name's Javier. Calling from London.
Awesome. Javier in London. What's on your mind?
I thought about continuing the discussion that we were having about determinism and neurology.
Awesome.
So, I wrote a list of questions, but I think they're really quick to go through, maybe some of them.
Go for it.
But just before that, someone brought up CBD, and I thought about asking you something about that. Would you say CBD affects qualia?
Right. Yeah. So let me ask you before we go into it. Have you studied philosophy?
I've actually never taken a philosophy class, but I read in my own, as it's a hobby of mine.
Awesome. That's very admirable. So qualia, what Javier is referencing, qualia refers to, it's really a term out of neurophilosophy that describes what it's like to experience the color red, right? Things that they would argue, folks like Searle, Nagel, Jeffrey Nagel would argue, these are examples of our components of consciousness that cannot be reduced down to a biological mechanism. So, for example, we can talk about how it is that we can perceive red till the cows come home, but you can never explain using deterministic biology what it's like to see red. And there's a bunch of thought experiments that you can do to sort of to explore that landscape. But so does CBD affect qualia? I mean, yes. I think anything that has even a subtle psychoactive effect, CBD doesn't have a very prominent psychoactive effect, but some, if it reduces anxiety, which some people claim it does, then that is a psychoactive effect. Then yes, inevitably. So in other words, any drug that alters your state of consciousness will kind of tweak the quality of qualia. Will sort of change what it's like to experience colors, to taste food. So yeah, I would think so.
By that kind of like perspective, wouldn't sucrose be, a substance that affects qualia then?
That affects
because,
qualia.
Someone feels more alert after they've had a sugary drink.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you can make that argument. I mean, some people feel more, sluggish when they've had something like sucrose, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if somebody's made, some kind of very specific distinction with regards to like a psychoactive drug versus, because sucrose is not a psychoactive drug. But I suppose, I mean, it could. I suppose you could make the argument that eating sucrose will alter the way that subsequent food will taste. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a very sort of persnickety, I think, point to make, but yeah.
I mean, many people do feel profoundly different when their sugar levels drop significantly.
Yes.
Like if they're and then as soon as they take the sucrose, by that viewpoint, it could be argued that it is kind of a psychotropic.
Yeah, I mean, but the difference is that, like, the sucrose itself is not directly interacting with any specific target within the brain. It is an indirect effect of changes in insulin levels and more of a hormonal byproduct. So it's a rather indirect mechanism. I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't have any, but it's like a subtle argument to make. But yeah, I mean, I agree.
So do you mean that sucrose has no effect on neurons in the brain?
Well, no, of course it'll have an effect on neurons, right? But it's not binding a receptor. It's not altering the way that neurotransmitter reuptake proteins or it's not altering the way that the system is operating in a direct way. It is providing caloric energy to neurons, but that, I mean, that is not going to, I think you'd be hard pressed to find any neuropharmacologist that would agree that sucrose or any molecule like sucrose has a pharmacological effect.
Would you argue that maybe CBD has is more akin to ethanol in that it can actually distorts perception in a way that ethanol can?
Well, so, I mean, the difference there is that ethanol does have direct pharmacological effects, very messy and variable effects. So, no, I mean, there are, like, nicotine, would be another example, probably closer to what you're arguing, more like sucrose, because, ethanol is a very powerful drug to alter your state of consciousness. Nicotine does alter your state of consciousness, but it doesn't inebriate you the way that alcohol does, right? So, I've tried CBD, and I didn't really feel anything. And, I would speculate that there are probably some people who are, like, genetically predisposed to reacting more significantly to CBD than me, for example, just, a pharmacogenomic effect. So I would say it's a pretty different category. Yeah.
So yeah, it seems like it's quite a nuanced topic of inquiry.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, some of it is arbitrary, right? Some of these categories are arbitrary. Like, why does it matter that this molecule interacts with this set of the parts of the brain, whereas, this molecule, this sugar molecule, only interacts with, things that are normally functioning in the brain. Like, who cares about that distinction? It's just more just like a useful way to talk about, these mechanistic distinctions.
Yeah. And when you mentioned qualia, you said Jeffrey Nagel.
Yes.
Did you mean Tom Nagel?
Tom Nagel. Oh,
Nagel?
yes. So there is a Jeffrey Nagel at Penn, where I went to grad school. Yeah, I guess, is it Tom Nagel? I mean,
Thomas Nagel actually wrote a book on consciousness.
yes, yeah. So it was him.
Really,
Yeah. Well, I think it's like what it's like to be a bat. I think. Yes, that's what I meant.
Yeah, so I mean, those are my CBD questions. Back to determinism. Do you not? I mean, it's totally, I think, totally different field. But don't you think real, difficult ethical issues arise as a result of taking a hard determinist view of human behavior? For example, imprisoning people for not paying their taxes and them experiencing road rage and out of a fit of passion or whatever word you want to attach to it, hurting someone or hurling racist insults. I mean, how do you get around that one? Or how would you propose?
I do not get around that. I mean, I 100% agree. I think that, if you take a determinist perspective, which once again, just to refresh, means that like physical events, physical dynamics are explicable by, measurable, dynamics. Whether we can see them or not, we can use computers or technology to help us to see X-rays and gamma rays and stuff like that. Okay, so yeah, I mean, if you, like I, would agree that free will doesn't really make sense from the perspective of modern neuroscience, unless you really massage what you are defining as free will. Then yeah, I mean, I think our criminal justice system, certainly in the United States, I mean, it sounds like you're probably in the United Kingdom, although perhaps you have very similar issues with your criminal law framework. But, we are notoriously extraordinarily punitive in this country. We have, a hugely disproportionate number of people imprisoned. And if you do agree that free will, at least as we would popularly conceive of it, doesn't really exist, then what are you punishing somebody who becomes addicted to heroin and is arrested for, dealing heroin? What are you arresting them for? Or like a crime of passion? What is the goal of a prison system? I wouldn't be the only neuroscientist to make this argument. I think the goal should be to mitigate any harm to society by this person. It's not to punish them, to deal retribution because they made a mistake and they deserve punishment, which is really how our law is pretty much devised. So yeah, I agree. I totally agree that it is a critical problem and really, really, urgently needs to be reformed.
Yeah. And just to see your stance on soft determinism instead, so a more compatibilist view, I was wondering what maybe is the reason for you not choosing that route. I mean, it's still a determinist way of thinking about human behavior and human thinking. And I recall, I think it was Daniel Dennett, who said that the majority of modern philosophers are actually compatibilists. So I'm unaware of their arguments that they've put forward for that, but I'm wondering what you come to think about that. And additionally to that, I recall reading an article that quantum uncertainty may play into this question of us actually having some kind of choice in some matters.
So, frankly, Javier, I would have to review. It's been years since I specifically read Daniel Dennett's argument, I think specifically against Sam Harris, on free will. It wouldn't be productive for me to just opine on that topic. So yeah, and what was the second topic? Oh yeah, quantum uncertainty. Right. So I think there's two issues with that. First is quantum uncertainty. If you are going to, confine free will within the human brain to just that, subatomic physical dynamic, then what you're really talking about is that it's randomness. It's not like you're actually making a choice. It's that your choice is the byproduct of some degree of randomness. And I don't think that most people would conceive of free will as just, that's not the same. Just because, it's what might happen might be unpredictable at some level, that means that free will exists. But then the second issue is, I'm not a quantum physicist, but I happen to be friends with some physicists. And, I've asked them, this question because, hey, if we're uncertain about, various, building blocks of our universe, and so therefore we can't actually predict where a given neurotransmitter is going to be or when it's going to be released, then then just how determinist can we be? So without exception, I mean, I think I've spoken to 3. Not a huge sample, but I think that the fact that they all independently provided the same response, I think it's meaningful, which is basically like quantum mechanics is extraordinarily important, and everybody should be a quantum physicist, but quantum mechanics is operative at a very specific domain of the universe, and as you move up and up and up to more complicated physical systems, there are more and more restrictions on that uncertainty, more predictability. And so because, neuroscience obviously is focused on very microscopic molecules interacting with one another and proteins, so it's still a rather small domain of the universe, but it's still a big enough system that uncertainty isn't really a meaningful, concern when it comes to how the brain is generating consciousness. And to me, I think that makes sense.
It seems akin to me to a description that I recall hearing an Oxford lecturer talking about light entering into the eye, passing through the retina, and then undergoing a filtering process where the less stimulated areas inhibit each other, and it's the areas that are more kind of focused on. So something I don't know if you know where I'm going with this. I don't fully recall.
Yeah,
but
I mean, okay. Do you mind if I ask how old are you, Javier?
24.
Really? Wow. Okay, that's awesome, man. Yeah, I mean, so the eye. So speaking of Daniel Dennett, one of my least favorite examples that he uses in his compatibilist argument is the after image effect. So, I'm sure everybody played with this when they were kids, where if you very briefly open your eyes and close them, or if you stare at an image for a long period of time and then close your eyes, you will see a sort of ghost of that image, sustained within your visual experience. And so he says, where does that experience exist physically, right? You're not being stimulated after all. You've ceased receiving photons from whatever stimuli it is, and so that is a non-physical source of your conscious experience. But that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how the visual system works, right? What we're talking about here are photoreceptors, a variety of different components of the visual system that basically become like strained and stuck and bleached. And so they're still being stimulated. They just doesn't happen, or they're still stimulating downstream, but it's just not arising from photons. So it's still a very physical substrate for that experience. It's just not the same substrate as what originally generated the image. Sorry, that topic that you brought up, the on-off fields, is what you're talking about. Just jarred that memory loose. Brush some cobwebs aside. So yeah, the eyes. I could go on and on about the eyes. The eyes are some of the most exploited components of our biology by people who argue a lot about evolution and consciousness. Human eyes are ridiculous. They're amazing. They're majestic achievements of natural selection, but they are so messy. Anyways, yeah. So what else? What do you have anything else on your mind?
I could go on, but I don't know if I'm going to bother you.
No. If you have one more, I hear the girls are home. So if you have another topic, I'd love to discuss it.
I was thinking, I don't know if I could contact you via Twitter. I was thinking about sharing a video with you, specifically on the topic of free will.
Let's do it. Yeah, please. My DMs are open.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess I'll just leave it at that then.
Right on. All right. That was a great conversation. Thanks for calling in, man.
Thank you. Take care.
I'm gonna have to review my neurophilosophy. I can't believe I don't really remember the arguments for compatibilism. And I remember the overall arguments of compatibilism, but not the specific sort of points that they use. Okay, let's do YouTube. So I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/anthropoid. Usually what I'll do is like the first 15 minutes before I like start live interactions. I talk about a specific topic. I've talked about Elon Musk's Neuralink and whole brain computer interfaces in general. I've talked about COVID-19, the neurophysiological potentially effects of COVID-19. I've talked about language, the evolution of language, a bunch of different things. So you can check it out, anthropoid.com/anthropoid. Is there a cure for old timers? Maintaining curiosity. Actually, I think there was a study that showed that the thing that distinguishes people who become sort of like stuck in their ways, I assume that's what you're referencing by old timers. By the way, I'm getting there. I'm almost an old timer at this point, certainly by internet standards. The thing that distinguished people who were amenable to new arguments, like willing to be convinced by a good argument, were those who considered curiosity to be an important feature of something that's worth teaching children, for example. So yeah, just stay curious. Stay curious, my friends. An extremely stereotyping anecdotal question: why do people get cantankerous ornery when elderly? Maybe this is in person. Guessing, psychology, frustration, loss of ability, etc. But is there a neurological reason? A lot of things change in the brain as we get older. But my suspicion is that there's almost certainly a better explanation to be found in psychology, maybe sociology, than neuroscience. But there are certain things that do influence, your sort of how steadfast you are, how stubborn you are as we get older. Like a very specific example is there's a certain kind of neuron that exists in the brain that essentially helps to transfer signaling information. Philosophers would get very upset with me using that term. From the forebrain to other parts of the brain. They're called spindle neurons, and as we get older, they begin to deteriorate. Their membranes become, and this happens just writ large throughout the brain, membranes become less fluid, so therefore receptor proteins can't really move along neurons. If you think of the surface of a neuron as like a swimming pool, you've thrown some life preservers in there, and they're just sort of floating on the top of this gooey, olive oil pool. That's sort of like what the surface of a neuron is. Things can move, and it's a dynamic surface, and so that it's sort of like you're making that pool even harder, even more viscous. Hey, what's up? It's Brent, right? Brett, yeah, cool to see you, man. Can you please explain why people get addicted to alcohol but not marijuana? Sure, that's well within my wheelhouse. So people do get addicted to cannabis. That is kind of a misconception. It's just that the addiction doesn't happen to be as severe as really almost any other drug, any other recreationally used drug. But cannabis is definitely habit forming. Essentially, any drug that somebody does for fun voluntarily is potentially habit forming. But the withdrawal from cannabis isn't life-threatening. The cravings aren't quite as severe as certainly alcohol. The withdrawal from which is life-threatening. There are not that many drugs where when you withdraw from them it's life-threatening, but alcohol is one of them. But cannabis, essentially any drug you probably have ever heard of, elevates dopaminergic signaling, elevates dopamine levels in a specific circuit within the brain, the mesocorticolimbic dopaminergic circuit. Mesolimbic is really the most important. Any drug you can name, essentially. I'm sure you could find some very specific exceptions of this one person who does this weird, who does I don't know, glucocorticoids or something, hydrocortisone. They're just super into that. But cannabis does that, and so as a result, there is a habit-forming component to it. That's just one reason that there's a habit-forming component to it. But alcohol, the difference is the reason that the withdrawal is more severe. Alcohol does elevate dopamine levels in that same part of the brain, but alcohol influences a wide variety of receptor systems, not just that dopaminergic signal. It influences serotonin receptors. It influences mu-opioid receptors. In fact, if you block mu-opioid receptors, people will stop self-administering alcohol, suggesting that there's a opioid component to the reward from alcohol. and NMDA's receptors, alcohol influences. And so the pharmacology is very wide. It's what we call messy or promiscuous. It's not like a very specific pharmacological effect like cannabis, for example. Cannabinoids bind cannabinoid receptors. There's a lot. Now, cannabis is a complicated drug because there's a ton of different kinds of cannabinoids, like a ton. Many of which even like advocates of cannabis haven't even heard of, like cannabichromine or cannabigerol. So it's a complicated drug, don't get me wrong, but we're really focusing on the cannabinoid receptors. Or amphetamine, focusing on dopamine receptors, dopamine transporters. But alcohol, you have to consider a whole wide variety of pharmacological effects. Among that pharmacological, messy, promiscuous pharmacological activity is GABAergic, is that alcohol changes the way that GABA receptors function, which is the main reason for why both benzodiazepines, which also do that, and alcohol withdrawal can result in seizures. In fact, back in the day, we used to have a name for the withdrawal syndrome from severe alcohol addiction called delirium tremens. And there's a very great Belgian beer named after it, which is kind of a little bit grotesque, I suppose, but it's a very, very good beer. But anyways, that's the main reason. And so you can have seizures. The suffering from withdrawal is that much greater from alcohol than it is from cannabis. And so there's a lot of different things that incentivize continued administration, meaning like relapse, or that make it difficult to even try and start to quit. There's a bunch of different reasons, but one of the main reasons is the severe withdrawal syndromes that people experience from alcohol, from opioids, from nicotine, by the way. So that's the main reason. Okay. The dog walker guy, what's up? What's the difference between thalamus and hypothalamus? Well, it's sort of in the name. So the hypothalamus is beneath the thalamus. It's like right beneath the thalamus. And now there are a bunch of other differences, but anatomically that's the difference. The other difference is that the thalamus, they are pretty different structures. Like they're not named that way because they're like cousins of each other. Like the thalamus is the home of a bunch of different subnuclei, some of which are some of the least studied in the brain. Like there's one that I encountered in my experiments where if you stimulate it, it'll cause any animal, including humans, to turn their head in a specific direction. But it's not like a motor thing. It's not like it's like forcing your muscles to do it. It's more like you're just interested in that side. You're just more interested in that side. And I could go on and on. It's very interesting. I think it's the interior central, I think. Interior central. Or is it interior ventral? I think it's interior central thalamic nucleus. And what's cool is that actually, if you look at my Twitter profile, the banner image, you can see some of it is red, which is kind of cool. Anyways, so the thalamus has all these subnuclei. The hypothalamus has a bunch of other subnuclei, but generally speaking, the hypothalamus is mostly associated with a lot of autonomic activity, a lot of this stuff that you don't have to think about to do, like digestion, appetite, body temperature, these types of things. It's very associated with more endocrine activity. The thalamus is kind of conceived of as being a kind of waypoint, a junction of a bunch of different signals. And so it's one of the things is how a bunch of different fibers move through the thalamus, so that one part of the brain is influencing signals in another part of the brain. That's not its only role. That is like when you take a neuroscience course, that's what you're taught, but it does a lot more. And one of the brain regions that I studied is like literally right on top. If the hypothalamus is so named because it's beneath the thalamus, my structure would be called the superior thalamic nucleus or something like that, because it's like right on top of the thalamus, called the medial lobennula. We call it epithalamic because it's on top. And the medial lobennula has it is also a junction, to be fair, but it has a lot of its own signaling that is unique to the structure. It's not just a junction of signaling, not alone. So that was probably far more than you were interested in going into. But listen, the girls are back from their walk. I'm sure I have a hungry baby, and I gotta feed her dinner. So I'm glad I made some time. I was able to make some time for this. I really do enjoy it. I promise next time I will prepare a topic. It might be this recent study that came out that suggests that the same color elicits similar emotional reactions cross-culturally all throughout the world. Kind of cool, right? Hey, what's up? Good to see you, Asha. So you can check that out hopefully next week, maybe sometime this week if I can make it work. I did talk about Neuralink last week, so you can check that out on the youtube.com/anthropoid. Literally the most recent one is about Neuralink. And I have a podcast called Wired to Be Weird. I have 2 podcast episodes devoted to Neuralink that you can check out where all fine podcasts are podcast. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. So thanks for joining. And hopefully I'll see at least some of you same time, about same time, same place next week. See you there. Thanks for joining. All right, YouTube, thanks so much for watching. As always, I'd love to hear any kind of feedback you have to make this better. Obviously, today I wasn't able to prepare something because I had to go to the doctor. Yeah, just let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed, I would appreciate it if you enjoy these kinds of chats or, when I talk about specific topics. So just, click your mouse on the subscribe button. You don't have to smash it. All right, other than that, have a great